Greetings, Slashaholics. This is David Bergantino, author of the Freddy Krueger's Tales of Terror books, the Bard's Blood horror Shakespeare books, and writer-designer of the upcoming horror video game, Return, One-Way Trip. You're listening to the 80s Slasher Librarian's narration of my book, Wes Craven's New Nightmare. Prepare to be scared.
Chapter 4. A whine like a dentist's drill echoed through the cold marble hallways. Its source was a room just ahead. Heather walked slowly, hoping her destination did not contain whatever made that sound. She didn't want to know what was making it, or what it was doing when it made the sound. Julie was back at the house with Dylan. She came right away after Heather had called. When she arrived, she threw her arms around Heather and started sobbing. Heather hugged back but did not cry. Perhaps later. She was determined not to cry until she saw the body. After all, this could be a dreadful mistake. Maybe Chase had been robbed by a hitchhiker who left him on the side of the road. Then the robber had crashed and the body they held was his, not her husband's. Chase might even arrive home while she was gone. The notion seemed less plausible and more desperate as the patrolman drove Heather to the morgue. It was unlikely such a huge mistake would have been made. But she clung to the idea anyway. Otherwise, she would have started crying. The morgue was in the basement, of course. The antiseptic smell that hit her when she stepped off the elevator couldn't hide the dark scent of death. Bodies lined her path, corpses on gurneys waiting for examination or transportation. She tried to ignore them. Heather stopped at a door with the words Los Angeles County Morgue stenciled on it. Beyond it came laughter and the disturbing whining sound. Heather swallowed and turned the doorknob. Just then, a woman's anguished wail reverberated from somewhere in the distance. Sounds like someone's desperate notion has just been torn from them, she thought sadly. Holding her breath, Heather opened the door and entered. When she did, she found 3 pairs of eyes staring at her. 2 belonged to attendants eating sandwiches from paper bags. A third attendant stood at a nearby table, lifting something wet and dark out of the corpse before him. Near him was a bloody tool that looked like an electric screwdriver with a small, circular saw attachment. "Help you?" the third man asked, dropping the organ onto a scale with a sickening plop. Heather's stomach lurched violently, and she swallowed hard to keep from throwing up. The others in the room seemed untroubled by the fact that while they were eating, an autopsy was being performed only a few feet away. "Porter?" she choked out when she could finally speak. "Chase Porter?" She hoped they wouldn't know what she was talking about, and she could leave. Chase was probably waiting at home for her right this minute. "That a new one?" the attendant asked, twiddling his bloody gloved fingers in the air while he tried to remember the name. For a moment, Heather thought her wish had been granted. She felt herself turning to leave. Then one of the attendants eating lunch spoke up and pointed past her. "Over there! Third from the sink." Heather saw where he was pointing. A body under a thick plastic sheet. Only the feet showed. She willed herself to move toward it. The attendant who had spoken up joined her and immediately checked the toe tag. But she already knew. Even pale and drained of blood, Chase had such wonderful feet. "You say Chase?" the man asked. All she could do was nod. "Sorry," he said with great sincerity. He lifted a corner of the sheet. Chase Porter, her husband, was dead. Blood matted down his hair, emphasizing the unnatural shape of his head due to the force of the accident. Despite that, his closed eyes made him seem at peace. She hoped he was. Wherever he was. The attendant lowered the sheet as Heather's gaze drifted to Chase's strong chin. Something caught her eye just before his face was covered completely. "Just sign at the bottom," he said, handing her a clipboard that had hung at the foot of the table. "That's all we need." Heather ignored the clipboard. The sheet still commanded her attention. "Let me see once more," she said, not taking her eyes away. "I'm sorry?" The attendant looked shocked. Apparently nobody ever wanted to see more. "Lift the sheet again," she commanded in a dull voice. Heather could tell the attendant didn't think she was serious, so she looked right at him to show just how deadly serious she was. Shaking his head in disbelief, he lifted the sheet again. Chase's face peeked out from underneath. "More," she told the attendant. He raised his eyebrows but lifted the sheet a little further. Heather could see Chase's chin now, and below it, what she had only glimpsed before. "What's that?" she asked quietly, pointing to a flap of whitish skin protruding from beneath Chase's chin. Well, this was a bad wreck, ma'am." "And if you ask for more, lady, I'm not going to give it to you," his expression said. "The next more will be too much, I can guarantee you that." "I mean, his head's going to be okay for the funeral and all, but—" Heather didn't ask for more. She took it. Reaching out suddenly, she tore the sheet back before the attendant could stop her. Chase's ravaged torso was entirely visible now. Holding it together were rough mortician stitches, along 4 long, deep slashes down his chest. Heather shrank back in horror, while the attendant pulled the sheet back over Chase. Her stomach bucked again, and this time she could not stop it. She spun around and vomited. When she was through, the attendant offered her a piece of cloth to wipe her mouth. She took it with shaking hands. "Oh, now, there, you okay, lady?" Despite the fact that she had gotten what she asked for, the attendant seemed truly sorry for her. But she wasn't finished. Heather wasn't ready to let Chase go yet. There was one more thing she needed to know. "What did that?" she asked in a terrified whisper. The man shook his head, amazed she didn't just give up. "Man, it was a head-on," he told her reluctantly. "I heard the truck was torn up something awful. You can imagine he'd, well, not be exactly in top shape." He had no idea how to comfort a woman who only wanted the bad news. "It looks like he was clawed." He nodded slightly, as if in agreement. "Yeah, well, that's why we don't lift the sheet past the face, ma'am. Sometimes what you don't see is what gets you through the night." Then he took her by the arm and escorted her upstairs, where the policeman waited to take her home. The next 2 days blurred by for Heather. During that time, Julie stayed at the house and took care of Dylan. Heather was almost completely non-functional all the while. Despite sedatives prescribed by her doctor, she never slept. But she was never truly awake either. Sometimes she would cry. Most often she simply stared. The best moments were when Dylan would come to sit on her lap. They'd sit together for an hour at a time, neither speaking, but communicating nonetheless. The next thing she knew, she was burying her husband. Surrounding her at the cemetery were her friends. Among them were Sarah and Bob from New Line, as well as Robert and Wes. Johnny Depp and John Saxon, her father in the Elm Street movies, had also come. A regular reunion, she thought dully. She was feeling no pain. The only thing connecting her to the moment was the pressure of Dylan's hand in hers. Julie stood on the other side of him. The service was ending as the casket began to sink into the grave. Heather whispered goodbye and looked down at Dylan. His expression remained as it had all morning, gray and unreadable as stone. His mind was still processing his father's death. A sudden gust of wind rustled the trees behind the gathering. The next moment the ground began to rumble beneath their feet. "Earthquake!" someone cried as the ground started heaving. The crowd scattered. Gravestones became crooked teeth rising from the grass. Nearby, a large monument fell over. The men lowering the casket were thrown away from the winches. One end unwound too quickly, tilting the casket at a wicked angle. It banged against the side of the grave and fell in first into the pit, landing with a sickening crack. Heather lurched forward, the moving earth tangling her feet, and she was launched toward the grave. Her head connected sharply with the metal framework. She dropped to the ground. In her daze, Heather could see the others stumbling over headstones, trying to find solid footing. Then, after what seemed to be hours, the shaking stopped. Silence returned. Silence except for the car alarms. Heather sat up slowly, rubbing the sore spot on her head. Julie came to help her up. Her son was nowhere in sight. "Julie, where's Dylan?" she shouted. The other woman stopped and looked around. Soon the others spread out to find him. Heather jumped to her feet in a panic. On a hunch, she peered down into the grave. And there, leering from behind the coffin's broken lid, was Freddy Krueger. Only it wasn't Freddy. Not like Robert was Freddy in the movies. This Freddy had the presence of a demon from the lowest depths of hell. Evil rose off him like the stink of 1,000 morgues, and his power was unimaginable. All this she felt in the moment their eyes met, before he withdrew into the darkness of the coffin, dragging Dylan down with him. Without hesitation, she leaped down into the pit. Dylan was just sliding into the coffin. She wrenched back the lid, and there he was, about to disappear into a dark slot at the bottom of the coffin. It was the danger area Dylan had described in his bed. This time, however, Rex was not there to keep the mean man away. She'd lose him if she wasn't quick. Diving forward, she caught his hand just in time. But Freddy, or whatever thing it was, didn't give up easily. It took all her strength to pull Dylan back. It seemed he would be torn apart. Then, with one last surge, she yanked harder, and the Freddy thing let go. Dylan came up through the slot. For a moment, Heather glimpsed an impossibly long arm, striped red and green, withdrawing into darkness beyond the coffin. At the end of the arm was the claw of her nightmare. She closed her eyes to shut out the sight, but could not block out the maniacal, mocking laughter that echoed all around her. Together, she and Dylan tumbled out of the coffin and into the pit. He was screaming. The laughter began to fade, and Heather opened her eyes. Chase stared at her, his dead eyes inches away. Her mind clamped shut, and she saw no more. The first sensation was of hands touching her, then voices, murmuring at first, then louder, saying her name. Where was she? Not at home. The smell of grass. Outside. Heather opened her eyes. Robert, Wes, and John hovered around concerned. Others farther away, someone missing. Who? Dylan! She cried in panic. Everything came back. The funeral, the earthquake, the Freddy thing dragging Dylan through the bottom of the coffin. She had passed out. Dylan was gone. She struggled to rise, but strong hands held her from going too quickly. Her head ached. He's right here, said John, pointing. It's okay. His voice was deep and calm. For 10 years he'd been like a real father to her. Now he commanded her attention like a father would, and she stopped struggling. Following his outstretched hand, she saw a shaken Julie. Next to her stood Dylan. His expression was at once intense, frightened, and eerie. John helped her to her feet. What happened? Apparently no one had seen. Quake knocked you off your feet. You got bumped pretty good, actually. He dabbed at her forehead with the handkerchief. She was bleeding. Bumped my head, but... Heather looked at the casket. It hung level once more and in one piece. Confusion tangled her thoughts and memories. No one had seen anything because nothing had happened. Or had something happened that no one but her could see? A small aftershock rolled through the cemetery, echoing the rumblings in her mind. Heather grabbed John's arm to steady herself from both. May he rest in peace, the minister said quickly, ending the ceremony to the relief of those gathered. And may you all get home safely. That said, he headed for his car, as did many others. Robert England did not rush away. He stood behind Heather quietly, waiting for her to turn around. Guilt had preyed on his mind for 2 days now. Guilt over Chase's death. It made no sense, he knew, but the feeling would not go away. Somehow he felt responsible, and being at the funeral just made it worse. Heather turned and bumped into him. Robert opened his mouth, prepared to apologize, but he didn't know what to say or what good it would do. She'd think he'd lost it. So Robert just put his hand on her shoulder and mumbled, If there's anything I can do, Heather, anything. What else could he say? Sorry, Heather, I killed your husband. If he was going crazy, he didn't need to take her with him. He pulled on his hat against the rising wind and left Heather to mourn her husband. John put his arm around Heather as she watched Robert walk away. Robert had been about to say something important it seemed. Robert was taking Chase's death harder than the rest of her friends. She hoped he was all right. Something in his expression made her start to wonder if he was having nightmares. She stopped herself right there. There was no sense going down that path again. Heather gave one last glance to the coffin before she let John walk her and Dylan to the car. She thought of the last time she had seen Chase alive. Their last long kiss had worn off hours ago, and she'd never have another. Seeing her fresh tears, John offered to come back to the house with Heather and Dylan, but she declined. That was sweet of him, she thought. She could use a strong presence like his around, even for just one day now that Chase was gone. However, one day turns to two, and two to four, and then a lifetime of relying on others suddenly goes by. Already it was obvious to her how much she depended on Chase for stability. She had to relearn self-sufficiency. That meant no more being afraid of nightmares or phone calls, no more reading into every unexplained look or gesture and getting serious professional help if it came down to that. Because if she didn't start fighting whatever was happening to her, she'd lose more than just her sanity. She'd lose Dylan, and that would be a loss from which she would not recover.
From the Journal of David Bergantino, June 6th, 1994. I shut off the ringer on the phone a few days ago because the sound was getting too distracting. Then I stuffed the answering machine under a pillow because the clicking it made when it picked up was downright annoying. Every night, or early morning, whenever I get done writing, I check for messages. Some guy named Jason LaCroix, he spelled it for me, has called 3 times in the last 2 days. Never heard of the guy, and he claims it's important that we talk. But that's all he says, except to give his number. Well, if it's important, he would have at least given a clue as to what he's calling about. I don't have time for guessing games right now. I'm too busy even to return my own friends' calls, let alone those of urgent strangers. If he really needs to talk to me, he'll call back again. My bet is that he's a salesman or something like that.
The wind continued to blow for hours after the funeral. Heather listened to it howl as she stared at the bedroom ceiling. The sound made her think of Chase screaming as he died. She was sure he had. No one tried to tell her that his death had been instantaneous or that he felt no pain. They knew she had seen the body. She had seen it at the funeral today as well. Had even crawled over it, she remembered. The wind seemed to be whipping her thoughts, keeping her awake. She pulled the blanket tighter and closed her eyes. She opened them at a sound from downstairs. Singing? Someone walking around? Dylan? She got out of bed and grabbed a robe. Peering into his room, she saw that his bed was empty. At the top of the stairs, she could just see his feet down in the living room, circling. Heather quietly descended the stairs until she could see his face. His eyes were closed, and he mumbled unintelligibly. Dylan was sleepwalking. She continued down the stairs, trying to figure out what to do. Supposedly it was dangerous to wake a sleepwalker, but he could hurt himself. Whatever she did, it had to be done gently. Dylan paused briefly near the television. She hadn't noticed until then that it was on. All her resolutions of courage shattered at the sight of herself on the screen. It was the Elm Street movie again. At the scene where Nancy, she corrected, is in the boiler room for the first time. Freddy stepped out from behind the furnace, a dangerous silhouette. Heather glanced over her shoulder, as if Freddy stood at the top of the stairs. The landing was empty, but she felt a presence nonetheless. She heard a thump and turned back to Dylan. He had veered out of his circle and walked into the coffee table. A glass bowl shook but did not fall. Then he turned and followed an invisible path into the kitchen. Forgetting the television for the moment, Heather followed. When she caught up to him, she wrapped her arms around him firmly but gently. His eyes were still closed. "Dylan, sweetie," she half whispered. "Wake up, baby." His eyes twitched beneath his lids, then they snapped open. Terror warped his face as he yelled out and pushed away from her. Arms pinwheeling, he landed on his back on the floor. She stooped down to hold him again, but he lashed out, kicking and flailing. He was violently defending himself against her, or who he thought she was. He stopped all at once, finally recognizing his mother. Heather was too stunned to move. The only sound became Dylan's labored breathing. "Dylan, baby, we're going to get you back to bed now," she said, reaching to pick him up. He wouldn't let her. His feet stamped against the floor and he shook his head. "I can't sleep there, Mommy," he cried. "Please." He was terrified. She knew the feeling, but Dylan was obviously in dire need of rest. "You've got to sleep, Dylan," she began gently. "You..."
1, 2, Freddy's coming for you,"
he sang, cutting her off. His voice sounded thin and frightened. Heather was unable to hold herself up and sat back heavily against the refrigerator. She tried to look at Dylan but couldn't focus. By the time her vision stopped swimming, his tears had subsided, but not his fear. It took 2 tries for her voice to work. "Dylan, did you hear that in that movie?" "What movie?" he asked, confused. Of course he knew what movie, Heather thought. He'd been watching it when she came down the steps. She looked over to the television and saw only a blank screen. There was a timer, so the television could have turned off by itself after they went into the kitchen. She dragged herself off the floor and returned to the living room. Dylan followed, baffled as if she were the sleepwalker now. She picked up the remote and zapped. Nothing. Zap. Still nothing. Maybe the batteries are dead, she thought. Heather pressed the power button on the television itself, but still nothing happened. Then she saw it. The wall outlet was in view just behind the television. The television was still unplugged from 2 days ago. She turned to Dylan. He watched her, too curious to see what she was doing to be afraid anymore. At the moment, she was frightened enough for both of them. "Then, where did you hear that song? Did you answer the phone?" He shook his head. "In my bed," he answered. "Your bed?" "Under my covers." Covers? The only thing under there was Rex and something else that Rex was supposed to be protecting Dylan from. "Kids singing," he continued, noticing her strange look. "And way down there, the mean old man." He hooked his hand, making the sign of the claw. It became very hard to breathe, and to see, and to remain conscious. She fought off the black flies that threatened to swarm her mind, and focused on Dylan. "And what's the man doing?" "Trying to get up," he said. "Trying to get up into our world." He seemed ready to say more, but a funny look came over his face. A moment later, thick blood flowed from his nose. "Oh shit, Dylan!" He touched his hand to the blood and stared at his fingers in shock. Heather grabbed him and rushed to the bathroom. The nosebleed stopped quickly, but it had scared him once more. He began crying again, quietly this time, as Heather cleaned away the blood with a warm washcloth. After his story of the mean man, Heather could not bear to make Dylan sleep alone. She took him up to her room, but before he would settle down, he insisted she bring Rex. Her bed became a little crowded with the 3 of them, but it was important that Dylan feel safe, and she could use a little of that feeling herself. He curled up next to her, and she listened as his breathing became deep and regular. She wished she could sleep, but at this point she needed to stand guard, in case Rex fell asleep. The wind continued to howl. She tried not to think about Chase screaming. She tried not to think about the television being unplugged. She tried not to think at all, but she couldn't stop thinking. "Where's Daddy now?" Dylan asked suddenly, startling her. Heather had been dreading this question, and now wasn't the best time for it, but she had to take a stab. "Daddy's in heaven." Truthfully, she wasn't sure herself, but Dylan was too young for philosophy. He needed to believe his father was in a good place. "He's with God now." He said nothing for a moment, and she thought he had fallen back to sleep. Instead, he was evaluating her answer. "Do you have to die to see God?" he asked. "No, I don't think so. You just have to pray or reach." She was winging it now. "Why does God let there be bad things?" "I honestly don't know. Try to sleep, baby." Dylan was trying to make sense of his father's death, she thought. His effort made her realize that she didn't have a suitable answer for her son. Perhaps not even for herself. The fact was, she'd never seriously considered the questions. Until now, Heather had only experienced death when it was inevitable, due to old age or a long, debilitating illness. Such mortality didn't demand an examination of one's beliefs. Violent, unexpected deaths like Chase's had a different effect. People were forced to confront those beliefs. Or, as Heather was beginning to realize, they faced a lack of beliefs. Dylan interrupted her current tangent with one final question. "Can you come with me in my dreams?" He was as serious as when asking about God, but this was an easier one to answer. It involved less esoteric beliefs that had been examined long ago. "I think that only happens in movies, but I'll always be here when you get back up." She lifted the covers and looked underneath with great drama. Rex's teeth showed dimly in the dark. "And I'll make sure nobody grabs your toes either." She tickled him and he giggled. It was the first time in almost 3 days. He turned over and closed his eyes. Finally, he's going to sleep, she thought. She found his laughter energizing. Still, if she was going to stay up all night, she'd need more caffeine. So she reached to the bedside table and gulped hot coffee from a mug. As she drank, she did not notice Dylan moving. Carefully reaching down, he turned Rex to face the darkness at the foot of the bed. Within an hour, both of them were asleep. Heather hung on longer, but the weight of the past few days finally pressed her eyes closed. Luckily, no nightmares awaited them. When morning came, Heather awoke calm and rested. It was a pleasant change from her recent habit of bolting awake screaming. Her mind was absolutely clear. For the first time in weeks, she felt ready for whatever the day threw at her. And when it started flying, this time she wouldn't duck. Her problems were not over. That much was certain. The business with the television still preyed on her mind. How had it been showing the movie while unplugged? She didn't even have to look at a cable guide to know Elm Street hadn't been scheduled that night. Or that first morning when she found Dylan watching just before the phone calls began again. Was it another delusion? Like thinking she had dreamed of the cut on Chase's hand, or what? Or was something horrible and impossible happening to both her and Dylan? The thought stirred up a profound dread deep inside. But the feeling no longer threatened to paralyze her. The instinct to cringe in the face of terror had fled in the night. Perhaps Chase had taken it with him. If so, he had left his strength in return. Heather got out of bed carefully so she wouldn't wake Dylan. He was resting comfortably. Hopefully he had been touched by his father as well. After she pulled on her robe, she patted Rex through the covers. "Keep up the good work," she told him. Dylan came down as Heather fixed breakfast. Unfortunately, his outlook was not much improved. He claimed to have had no dreams, but clearly something was on his mind. She didn't push him. As last night showed, even frightened, he never hesitated to ask questions. Heather just hoped to have better explanations when the time came. Gaining a perspective on her own feelings about recent events would help them both. The isolation was the first feeling that had to be eliminated. It meant imposing on someone, a move she had rejected earlier, but really, she had no choice. She could no longer go this alone, and her objectivity was suspect at the moment. Wes and his nightmares came to mind again. Perhaps he was a good choice for confessor, after all. While he was a dear friend and would easily be sympathetic, what she needed was someone totally outside the experience. Wes might be too keyed into his own nightmares to help her effectively. Her feelings needed to be picked apart and the real issues identified. But a psychiatrist wouldn't work either, not at this stage. She needed someone practical, not clinical. It was important to find someone who already knew her history or was even a part of it. Her father, had he been alive, would have been ideal for this task, so she called her other father, John Saxon. John agreed to meet her that afternoon in a nearby park. She wanted to get Dylan out of the house. His mood had improved only marginally by lunchtime. He was quiet and mostly kept to himself. The idea of going to a park perked him up a bit, but not much. At least he didn't seem upset, just preoccupied. And considering everything he'd been through, his behavior was normal enough. When they got to the park, Heather found a bench at one end of the playground, which was dominated by a 25-foot-tall metal rocket. It was crawling with children. Not feeling sociable, Dylan played on the swings while Heather awaited for John. As soon as he arrived, Heather knew she had done the right thing. He looked tanned and fit, younger than her father had been when he died, but looked paternal nonetheless in a new sweatsuit. His smile alone put her at ease. Still, she realized that, as reassuring as his presence might be, that in itself did not solve anything. So she told her story, and John listened patiently. When she got to the part about Dylan, she could feel the dread beginning to bubble up again. "I know what he's doing is bizarre," she told John, "but most of the time he seems so normal, so well-adjusted. I just can't believe it's him. I mean, that it's not something outside influencing him." It was the first time she mentioned her suspicion that there might be an external force at work. Looking into John's eyes, sitting in a park filled with children playing, it seemed a sadly desperate thing to say. "Or is that how denial works?" she asked him. Her courage sprung a tiny leak. "When it is denial," John answered, dismissing any self-doubt as unworthy of her. "I don't think that's the case here. But if you're really worried, have a doctor check him out. You'll see. Everything's fine." Heather searched his face for signs he was humoring her. She found none, but she had to ask, "You're not just saying that to help a crazy friend cope, are you?" John smiled and shook his head. "All of Dylan's behavior is understandable for a kid dealing with a parent's death. How can a child process such a thing?" "Don't know," Heather replied. "Haven't been able to process it very well myself." She was fighting to keep from shutting down again. "You're not crazy, by the way," he said quickly, as if sensing her withdrawal. She didn't believe she was crazy either, but unfortunately, insanity was actually preferable to the alternative, that she was sane and something evil was after her and Dylan. Then again, maybe that was proof that she was insane after all. Her mind had twisted into a Mobius strip, where the rational and the irrational alternated in a twisted, infinite loop. "Thinking I saw Freddy in the grave feels pretty crazy," she said, starting down the rational but insane path. "And jumping in?" "You didn't jump in," John interjected. "That's my memory, and it seemed absolutely real." And suddenly she was on the other side of the loop, irrational but sane. "Seemed, not was," John emphasized. He was trying to clear away her confusion. It was almost working. Dylan now stood beneath the rocket, half-heartedly drawing pictures in the sand with a stick. Heather saw him and knew she had to tell John her family heritage. "It's in my family, you know." She spoke low and ashamed. "My grandmother died in an institution." Her voice trailed off. Now she was truly embarrassed. John was unfazed. "Really?" he asked dryly. "Hell, if having a screwy family made you crazy, the world would be one colossal nut house." Was he serious? She wondered, turning to him. He was serious. His big grin told her. He laughed, and she couldn't help but laugh herself. John saw he was making some headway and pressed his point. "Look, you've got a crazed fan after you. That's what's making you crazy. And probably Dylan, too." "I've never mentioned it to him." "Kids know when something's bugging a parent." That problem solved, John switched gears. Though he sympathized with her about the psychotic caller, the situation seemed to intrigue him. "You've got no idea who's been calling?" Heather looked past John's shoulder to watch Dylan in the playground again. She only had one guess as to who the caller's identity was. "Freddy, for all I know," she said, knowing how it sounded. "Steady," he warned. She drew strength from his voice and managed to smile. This discussion was about reality, she reminded herself, not paranoid delusions. She made an effort to stay on track, not that she could trust where it would lead, and gave him a more reasonable answer. "A man? Or a boy with the deep, Freddy voice?" Still, would a Freddy-like voice scare her so much? But even the real Freddy was a fictional character. Her mind did another lap on the Mobius strip. John took her gently by the shoulders and looked right into her eyes. 6 weeks of this, and you're surprised you've got Freddy in your dreams? She tried to look away, but he wouldn't let her. She wanted perspective. She was going to get it. Hell, Sonny Bono says after a while he was seeing his stalker everywhere, even at Mass. Really? Heather had heard something about that. Her first reaction had been to wonder who on earth would want to stalk Sonny Bono. She was a lot more sympathetic now. "Absolutely," John said, driving his point home. "And how many times has Letterman called the cops thinking that woman was down in his kitchen again? It gets under your skin if you let it." She had to admit she was good at letting things under her skin. But that was just her. What about her son? "You really think Dylan's okay?" He smiled a warm, fatherly smile. "Dylan's fine. You're fine. Hurting, but fine." He held her in his gaze for another moment and added, "Definitely not crazy." Between the look on his face and the conviction in his voice, Heather was almost won over. She had meant to be, wanted to be, and as his eyes pleaded with her to accept comfort and reason, neither of them noticed Dylan squeezing through a broken guardrail at the top of the rocket. "It's my worst fear," she told him, shaking her head, "that whatever my grandmother had, I'll have and I'll pass it along to..." And she instinctively looked over toward the rocket. Dylan now stood on the nose cone, shakily balanced, stretching his arms toward the sky. He was going to fall. At first, Heather froze. John saw her look and turned around. Other children and parents began to point. A murmur ran through the playground. Dylan didn't notice. He seemed concerned only with touching the clouds. His hand strained upward, harder. His feet slipped slightly. He compensated, catching himself, but that threw him in the other direction. His body wobbled like a top, losing its spin. As his hands grabbed for purchase in thin air, he lost his balance entirely. With a cry, he fell from the rocket. In Heather's mind, the entire playground and everyone on it had frozen, except for Dylan, who was falling slowly. Then she was moving around the soft-shelled mannequins toward her son. Dylan still falling, her shoes slapping on concrete, then one crunching in sand. Now her arms extended, Dylan just out of reach, both feet in, and now, slam! Dylan landed on Heather like an anvil and drove her to the ground. For an infinite minute the world tasted like sand, rang in her ears and hurt like hell. Then a weight was lifted off of her, and she was helped to a sitting position by John. She randomly wondered if he wasn't getting tired of scraping her off the pavement. When the playground had stopped spinning, she looked to see Dylan, sitting next to her very calmly, gazing up at the sky. He seemed unhurt, and completely unaware of his close call. Only a disappointed expression showed on his face. Then he turned toward her. "God wouldn't take me," he said.
From the Journal of David Bergantino, June 7th, 1994. Oh God, oh God, oh God, oh God, oh God, shit! Just woke up. Freddy got me, not killed, grabbed my foot. Jeez, it hurts. I must have banged it on the wall or something. Wait a minute, I'm bleeding. My fucking foot's bleeding. Hold on. Later. Got a bandage around my foot. You're gonna love this one. The sole of my foot had a tidy little gash down the center of it. What is it, 3 in the morning or something? 4? I can't tell. Knocked my clock over. Hold on. 4:27. Hey, buddy, can I have a piece of your mind? 'Cause I'm fresh out of mine. I'm not going back to bed. I'm not going to lay down on the couch. And I ain't going back to sleep. Don't ask me to work on the book either. It's times like this I wished I took drugs. Oh well, I guess I'll just have to cope. Later. Okay, so now it's late morning and I just read my after-nightmare rant. Man, was I scared. Abject terror sure makes you a bad speller. At least I got the swear words right. And that was a doozy of a dream. It was the first time he, shuddering at the thought, touched me. And then the cut. It still hurts. Also, I got a fair amount of blood on my sheets. When I took them off my bed this morning, a soda can tab, or beer can tab if you must know, fell out onto the floor. I collect them for a diabetic friend who exchanges them for time on a dialysis machine. Apparently, one ended up in my bed. In my tossing and turning, credit for tossing and turning goes to one Freddy Krueger. I managed to slice my foot open on the jagged part that sometimes remains when the tabs are torn off the cans. Well, there's one mystery solved. I hope. Was going to do a big push on the book today, but between the exhaustion and the injured foot, my desire to write is a smidgen dampened. I think today's a beach day. Sunscreen and some dozing. Never had a nightmare on a beach. Could use the break. I know, that's 3 days in a row and I'm on a deadline. But at this rate, I'll have gone crazy and or lost a limb before I can finish anyway. So, I'll get back to writing tomorrow. Or the next day.
Okay, Slashaholics, this has been Chapter 4 of Wes Craven's New Nightmare, a novel by David Bergantino. That was an intense chapter. That park scene is one of my favorite scenes of the movie. Very intense. Wes Craven built up a lot of intensity, edge-of-your-seat stuff in that scene. And David did a great job bringing that intensity to the page of the novel. Anyways, guys, I'll be back very soon with more of this book, and as I've said before, the reason I'm not doing my end chapter commentary reviews like I've done on all the other books is because I'm going to do a completely separate video once I'm finished with this book. It's going to be a review/discussion on the movie and the book, and I've got some fun stuff planned for that I just can't fit into this end commentary thing on the chapters, and I don't want it to take away from the book. But as always, tonight's upload was brought to you by our patrons on Patreon. That's Carl Eakins, Catherine McClear, Sean Campbell, and Cecilia Spears. Thank you guys so much for sponsoring the channel. This channel requires a lot of time and money to get these very rare, very hard to find books in my possession, so I'm able to record them for everybody. And the Patreon really helps with that, because I'm not able to monetize the channel. The copyright holders of the material get my ad revenue automatically. So any help with the Patreon or the merch store is greatly appreciated. You can sponsor this channel for as low as $2 a month through the Patreon. Just check out the link in the description below. You'll be helping out the channel a lot, and depending on which tier you select, there's some really awesome rewards for being a patron. Alright guys, until next time, this has been your friendly neighborhood 80s slasher librarian saying, thanks for listening, keep it scary, and pleasant screams!